Hi, Misha here, and for really no reason, I just felt like revisiting the Mitsubishi A6M0. And officially this was the Zeke Allied code name, but it was a 0. And even if people don't know Japanese airplanes from World War II, they still know the 0. So just some comments. I'm not going to try to do a terribly thorough history, anything like that. But I laid out 6 different 1/72 scale diecast models. Up here is probably the best quality. This is a Corgi A6M2 variant. Down here is an Air Force One, presumably an A6M2 as well, but it's a little different. It's a little confusing as to exactly what they were going for. I might be overthinking it. Here we have a Witty Wings A6M3. And here we have, well, I think it's actually an Atlas, but it's the old IXO tooling A6M3 as well. Over here we have a Witty A6M5. I'm not exactly sure of the sub variant. And then finally we have a Agostini A6M5C. So yeah, I just thought I would talk a bit about and give some observations. Just a little more on the 0. Why not? The A6M2 is kind of the quintessential 0 that people think of. It was what was there at Pearl Harbor, Battle of the Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. Of course, it wasn't the first version, although it really was the first to go into full production in a way. The 0 was ordered. Well, in 1937, the A5M Claude was coming in, Claude being, of course, the Allied reporting name. But while it was actually a pretty advanced plane for its day, mono wing and everything, they wanted something with a lot more. And it's pretty famous in history now that what the Japanese Navy asked for was considered impossible by Nakajima. Mitsubishi took on the challenge. They wanted very long range, the endurance. They wanted it to be able to operate from carriers. They wanted speed, maneuverability. They really wanted it all. And amazingly, Mitsubishi managed to deliver. You can read up on all the specs and everything. That's, neither here nor there right now. And in 1939, the first prototypes flew. And really the only suggestion they had was to go from a 2-bladed propeller to a 3. And the first version was known as the A6M1. But it was quickly suggested once it was ready that Mitsubishi fit it with Nakajima's Sakai engine for more power. And this resulted in the A6M2 Model 11, the first version. And these would be accepted, and first ones be given to the Navy in July of 1940. And they would first start to see some use in China in August and September. And then a dedicated carrier version would be adopted as the A6M2 Model 21. And the big difference was it had folding wingtips. At this time, they had 2 20mm cannon and 2 7.7mm machine guns, plus the ability to carry 500 pounds, give or take, in bombs. And by the standards of 1940, this was an amazing machine. It not only was great as a naval fighter, it was great as a fighter, period. Up until this point, naval fighters were always inferior to land-based counterparts. Well, the Zero changed that. By the way, the name Zero, it was officially adopted as the naval type year 2600 for the Japanese calendar, or just Zero. But it was the first one that could really go up against land-based fighters and succeed. It had range, it had the maneuverability, and for 1940, 2 cannons and 2 machine gun, that was pretty damn good as far as armament. But the main thing was its range. It could really hang or patrol a long range, and the fact that it could successfully operate from carriers really made it important. By the time of Pearl Harbor, they had about 520 in military service, and of course they were cranking out more and more as they could. And this was frontline, the M2, all the way through 1942, with the last time it was considered a premier fighter being around October during the Guadalcanal campaign. It's one reason I went ahead and brought the Air Force One model out, just because it does show that it has a drop tank. It was actually one of the earlier naval fighters to be commonly fitted with drop tanks. It had retracting landing gear. It had quite good speed. Now the exact speed would depend on the model and the loading, but around this time it's around 330 miles per hour. But it wasn't perfect. Nothing in this world is. But in that time, it really bested everything it went up against. For example, think about the F-2 Buffalo. It was definitely superior to that. The Russian I-16, which it faced in China, and of course the American F-4F Wildcat. So it really wouldn't be until America started to adopt new fighters that the Zero would have to up its game. But for a while it was one of the best in the skies. Now American fighters even then had some advantages, but all in all, the Zero was winning out in early 1942. But then newer planes like the P-38, the F-4U, and of course the F-6F would start to come online. And technology would progress very rapidly in World War II. So what was good in 1940 would be very quickly obsolete a year or two later. And that wasn't just for the Zero, that was anything. And look at the German aircraft. So, thus comes in the A6M3 series. The A6M3 has a bit of that awkward middle child syndrome. The M2 had been fitted with the Sakai 12 engine, and then in 1941 they test flew a version of the Zero equipped with the improved, more powerful Sakai 21 engine, and these were put into production in the spring of 1942, but it took some time to actually get them really built because they had delays in getting new engines. So they really didn't start getting into squadrons and numbers until the end of 1942. Now this would be the Model 32 that started off. They went away from the folding wingtips, they went to a shorter wing with a squared off edge. They did increase the number of rounds in the cannon from 60 to 100. And because of the new engine, they had to move the mounting back a bit, and they had to decrease the internal fuel tank volume and the fuselage. In some ways, the plane had better performance, For example, it had better dive, but it also sacrificed some in maneuverability, and because of the different design and the heavier weights and everything, it actually was only about 10 or 12 miles per hour faster after all this. And more importantly, it had much less range than the Model 21 before it. Thus, the 32, after only producing less than 350, they would actually switch over to the A6M3 Model 22, which is a bit of a reversion. They went back to the old wing style with folding tips. They added more internal fuel storage in the wings. Of course, we still have drop tanks. Now we can actually carry them under the wings too. And this would be the predominant carrier fighter in the 1943. It had more firepower, more rounds, and it restored the range. We had a more powerful engine. It had a little bit better high altitude performance. But this is when, in 1943, the Zero really started to look a little dated. Now, plans had been around for a very long time to just replace it with what was known as the A7M. But because of the war and the way things were going for Japan, this never actually came into fruition outside of a handful of prototypes. So they had to make do with their existing Zero. Unfortunately, America had the resources to put all new airplanes into service. And yeah, by 1943 you start to see the F6F and the F4U coming into service, which just outclass the Zero. But they had what they had, and so they made do. Now the A6M4 was a prototype series that never went into full production. So the next production series was the A6M5. Well, the A6M5 prototype first flew in mid-1943, and it was really put into production late that year. At this point, the Japanese knew that it was outclassed, but there wasn't anything to replace it. Programs such as the A7M and the J2M were experiencing delays, so they had to make do. And there are several versions of the A6M5. In fact, it was the most produced model. The basic one was very similar to an A6M3, late production. Originally, the Type 99 20mm cannon in the wings were given longer barrels. These were considered Type 99-2. And they still retained the two 7.7mm machine guns. They went to a new wing, a little bit shorter, not by a whole lot, but a little bit shorter. And they went to new exhaust stacks for the engine to try to eke a little more power out. And these would be used during the Battle of the Philippine Sea during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The A6M5A would be a further improvement, as would the A6M5B. Now, it's worth noting that they were starting to try to apply things like self-sealing fuel tanks and more armor. The armor was originally left off because, well, they had a weight quota to meet. The self-sealing fuel tanks were left off in 1940 because most airplanes did not have them. But at this point, especially after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Navy wanted more armor and more armament. So they would go from drum-fed to belt-fed machine guns in the wings. They would also replace one of the 7.7mm guns in the fuselage in the body with a 13.2 millimeter machine gun, essentially a Browning M2, but firing a metric caliber. They would get up to over 350 miles per hour, and first they would get to a dive speed of 410 and then even 460 miles per hour. So some of the performances here were quite good, but they were still using the Sakai 21 engine, even if they tweaked it somewhat. But then in 1944, the A6M5C would first test fly, and it would go into production late that year. And this is the most armed version. They would install two 13.2 millimeter machine guns in the wings. They would have the 20 millimeter cannon in the wings. They would still have the 13.2 millimeter machine gun in the fuselage, although they would go ahead and delete the 7.7 millimeter machine gun because it was pretty useless at this point. So they would have three 13 millimeter machine guns and two 20 millimeter cannon, and they would have increased the ammo capacity for the cannon. And finally, the C model would for the first time have wing racks for unguided rockets. They also would try to install self-sealing fuel tanks, but it didn't work. They never really did. They did install, first on the earlier versions, they installed bulletproof glass, and then later with the C they would install a metal armored headrest for the pilot. But of course all this armor and armament came at a cost of weight, and now because we're still using the same engine, the performance really starts to dip. So even though they have more armament, yeah, they're starting to kind of go back the other direction. Meanwhile, American aircraft are just improving day by day. And that's, of course, where we get into kamikaze. Now, to be fair, the first kamikazes were older M2s, kind of hastily retrofit for that. But actually, very quickly, they would use M5s. And this model here, like I said, was from Witty, is actually of a kamikaze version, which I thought was neat. Plus I like that it just has the two long-barreled cannons, not the four. And so yeah, I mean at this point the design is well past its prime. It's even past its best buy date. And it's obsolete, and they know it. And they tried to put a new engine in it, but for logistical reasons, it just wasn't happening, and the Navy wouldn't approve it. There was just no way. Really, after the Great Marianas Turkey shoot, the Japanese Navy, with the exception of the kamikaze, really was no longer a threat. Their airplanes were outdated, their pilots were no longer well trained, all their skilled pilots were dead or captured. Their machines were running out, their ground technicians didn't know how to keep them running like they used to, the materials were getting of lower and lower quality. So, yeah. Now there were other versions planned and even made in small numbers, like the A6M6. But for all intents and purposes, the A6M5 was the last real version. And of the C version, they only made like 100. So, yep. So from really being the best to honestly one of the most obsolete. But that's kind of the story of a lot of Japanese hardware in World War II. They never really went to new versions. They might, new models. They might go to new versions, new variants, but they knew from the beginning they weren't going to be able to win a protracted war. Honestly, after a year, the war was already lost for them. It took longer to sink in, but it really tells their equipment and their personnel. So yeah, what about the models themselves, kind of comparing them? Well, when you do 172 scale and not 148, your options are often limited. Not as bad as World War I. Most of those are all 148. But for example, the Hobbymaster Zeros, they're all 148, which is fine, but if you're going to do that scale, then you can't do a lot of the more interesting planes like B-17s and stuff, so what have you. The Air Force One here, like I said, I don't even know exactly what they were going for. Hard for me to judge. Maybe I'm just not understanding it, but yeah, it has some elements like the wings that kind of remind me of a, I don't know, yeah, anyway, hard for me to really judge it. It's kind of in fact, some websites called it a M5, but it seems to be an M2, but I'm not going to swear to that. The Corgi, they actually do this one. They haven't done any ones recently, but this one is one that does have the pilot figure, does have gear up or down, of course spinning propeller. They also did some in their Warbird series, which were just gear up, no pilot, but quite nice. Now the problem is they do some that they call M2, which is fine, but then they do some they call M3, which it still seems to be in M2. But then again, when you look at the Model 21 and the Model 22, the lines, it gets blurry, honestly. But yeah, the Corgi is probably the nicest quality. Although I will say the Witties, for what they are not bad at all. They put a lot more, small little details. No, they only come gear down, but they do typically have rolling landing gear, and they have crew figures. Really, the only ding against them, I guess, is the fact that it's just gear down, because they do come with the fuel tank or bomb underneath and whatnot, but of course the Witties are long out of production. They actually put some energy into making the M5 look different than the M3, which I appreciate. Having the two cannon, you can even tell this has the slightly smaller wing because of where the tube is on the wing here versus on this one. You can tell the wing's a little bit longer. That's nice. They didn't quite get the engine cowling right, but that's okay. And as far as ours up here, the IXO tooling has been used by Atlas Editions, De Agostini, Warmaster, Solido. I've always thought that's a good value. You do get gear up or down. You sometimes get a detaching ordnance. You get spinning propellers. But you don't get crew figures. And the detail level, again, is not bad, considering these are the cheapest. The C here is kind of neat, having the 4 guns sticking out. And they did a good job with the 3. They come with stands and whatnot. So I really like the Agostini stuff. I have to say, probably my favorite are the Witty, just because they do M2s, M3s, and M5s, and M5Cs. They do the most versions. And again, the only thing you're really giving up is gear up or down. The Corgi, of course, is typical Corgi quality, but they haven't made them in so long, so it's one of those things. Their warbirds are nice for what they are. Really, it's one of those things where beggars can't be choosers. I wish someone did even some more variants, but most companies are too busy doing their 100th Spitfire or their 500th P-51 Mustang. Planes I both like, but it does get a little old after a while. I wish, honestly, even, Zeros are, but how many other Japanese planes do you see? Moreover, how many Russian planes? How many, go find a MiG-3. I think Agostini's done one, but yeah. Seems like these manufacturers kind of get stuck on the big, most popular planes and neglect some really lesser known, but still very interesting planes. Just my personal take. I don't know, just felt like revisiting the Zero tonight. Nothing too comprehensive, but yeah, a little bit on the differences, the major variants here. If you have any questions, please post them below. As always, I appreciate you tuning in. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.